Hello, this is Darsonovia. This is my review on Spock's World. This is a novel that was written in the late 1980s, written by Danny Cheni, and I think Spock's World, is an interesting read, but I'm not going to get into that, you know, into depth this early in the review. Now, I'm just going to talk about continuity. In terms of continuity, this novel takes place after Star Trek the Motion Picture. So this would be a movie era Star Trek novel. And this also, despite the title, it isn't all focused on Spock. This novel is takes place mainly on Vulcan, and this is one of the few occasions where Star Trek fiction actually explored what the culture of the Vulcans are, and even gives an origin to the Romulans. Now, this isn't compatible with modern Star Trek canon, a lot of the stuff in this novel, considering Enterprise would come out the in the early 2000s, late 90s, and it would contradict material that's written in here, but material from Spock's World has been used in later iterations of Star Trek. It's not the most canon compatible, but that doesn't mean this story is worth anything less, because I think it's a really good story. And some of my favorite Star Trek stories are the ones that flesh out a culture of a civilization. And the Vulcans are an interesting species. There's no shortage of novels that have Vulcans in them that explore their culture. There's a lot of them, but this is one of the few novels at the time that did that. And there's like two sections of this book, and I think, in my opinion, both of sections of this book could have easily been their own book themselves. So the main story is basically, the main plot is Kirk, McCoy, and Spock debating with the population of Vulcan to stay in the Federation. And why is there a secession movement on Vulcan in this book in the first place? Well, the reason why there is because there's portions of the Vulcan population that don't see a benefit of being in the Federation, because they see humans as harmful to their culture. And we actually explore, how there are legitimate fears from the Vulcans of humans trying to enforce their culture onto Vulcans, and Vulcans not wanting to enforce their culture onto humans. And it's very fascinating to read about this. And old enemies and allies, that were introduced in the original Star Trek series appear in this book. And I do like how this novel addresses certain, things about those characters. Now, what I really enjoy about this book, at least the main section of this, is I actually think it was definitely, something you would expect in a Star Trek novel. In fact, I would argue this could have easily had been a great Star Trek episode had this been made into an episode, because there was a lot of great moments, especially when McCoy was making his passionate speech for the Vulcans to stay in the Federation, because he talks about, based on his experience with Spock, on how valuable the Vulcans are and what they bring to the Federation. And another thing that I find really interesting is it explores somewhat of a side of McCoy that you didn't see in the movies and the show. Yeah, he may make some remarks to Spock once in a while because of his Vulcan heritage, but at heart, come on, he's not a bad guy. Kirk's speech also stands out for me, and Spock's. And the way these speeches were presented and the way that they were presented it felt realistic. It felt like this is something that you would actually see from Star Trek. And the author who wrote this novel, I feel she understood Star Trek, the original series, even though this takes place in the movie era of the original series, where the characters are like in their middle years and they're like getting older. I do like the fact that it still feels like they're the characters that you would expect to see at that age. Even though by the time this novel was published, there was like there was like at least 4 to 5 Star Trek movies at this point. I don't know if Star Trek 5 was out yet, but whatever. It felt like the author knew what the heart of Star Trek is. And if I could sum up what Spock's world is, it's essentially Star Trek at its heart. At its core, that it explores the optimistic future of Star Trek, and how just because we're in a post-scarcity society doesn't mean there won't be conflict. And there's another portion of the story of this novel, which I honestly, if I could be real, I think you could skip this portion if you want to, because the two stories that happen in this book, the Vulcan chapters and the chapters that focus on the Enterprise crew, yeah, they aren't unrelated, but I feel like you could have separated these two stories into different books, because the Vulcan portions focus on the Vulcans' past, the Vulcans, what they were like at the early stages of their history, all the way to the point where Spock was born. Though, if you are like me, who like to read about the alien civilizations and science fiction, and like to read about the development of alien civilization and science fiction, you may enjoy this part. I mean, this part can easily stand on its own. And another portion that likely doesn't, fit in modern Star Trek canon because of shows like Enterprise and whatever novels that may have come after this. But I think both stories are both worth reading, and I do think that both stories do connect to some degree, even though I've heard some people complain about the constant flashback to the Vulcans' past, and when it interrupts at a certain moment in the present. I do feel like without these chapters, you wouldn't have the impact towards the end of this novel that you would have had it not been exploring the past of Vulcan. Now, each of one of these sections could have easily had been taken out and have been their own book, but I do think on its own, Spock's World is a good read. Yes, Spock's World does, not fit in modern Star Trek canon. Yes, Spock's World, does contradict certain things that would be contradicted later, such as First Contact. Vulcans, according to this book, weren't, humanity's first contact, even though anyone that knows Star Trek lore knows, no. It is clearly established in Star Trek First Contact that Vulcans were the ones that made first contact with humanity. But then again, this contradiction is forgivable because Star Trek First Contact, the movie, would not come out until the mid-1990s, and this was published in the late 1980s. So a contradiction like that is understandable, considering they didn't have that knowledge back then. And of course, there's another Star Trek novel that talks about basically warp drive technology, and that would be contradicted by First Contact. So none of this stuff is new. But despite the continuity hiccups with the modern Star Trek, canon and the literary verse, which by rules or law, whatever you want to call them, has to basically adhere to modern Star Trek canon. It has to adhere to the canon of the shows. If the shows do go a different direction from the books have to drop what they established in the literary verse. I mean, they recently had to jettison over 20 years worth of continuity with post-Dominion War and Nemesis stories because of Star Trek Picard, Lower Decks, Prodigy, or any other shows that could come up in the future. So the Star Trek novels have to reflect the modern Star Trek canon. Anything that's introduced in the shows, it has to be reflected in the novels. Yes, I know the Star Trek novels are not canon, but Spock's World is one of those stories where I think you should read it because I do think it's a really good story. It's one of the first stories that explores the culture of the Vulcans and their history and how they became what they are today. And in all honesty, I would gladly read this again in the future, knowing that it doesn't completely fit in the modern Star Trek canon. I don't care. I think Spock's World is one of the best Star Trek stories, in my opinion, because I think it's at its core a Star Trek story that explores themes that are completely in line with Star Trek. And may we live long and prosper. I know this is a short review, not as long as I would normally do, but I don't have much left to say without repeating myself. I think this novel is really good. There's no reason for me to go on. I give this a classic rating. It's a classic, Star Trek story that I think a Star Trek fan who is curious about reading Star Trek novels, I'd check this one out. May we all live long and prosper. Peace out.